dementia begins often decades before the presentation of symptoms. This is a disease of midlife. Like, this is a disease of now, with symptoms that appear in late life. So by the time you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, or likely any form of dementia for that matter, you're already essentially in the late stage of that disease. Yes, that's scary and sad, but it's also, I think, incredibly empowering from the standpoint of prevention, because that means that we have a window of opportunity to intervene, right? To change the course of our destiny.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we have Max Lugavere on the podcast.
What up, Nick?
Welcome.
How you doing?
How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's an honor to be here.
So as I was telling you, I just finished watching your film. Me and my wife just finished watching your film, Little Empty Boxes, that releases 6/27, correct?
Yeah.
June 27th, which is at the time of this recording in a few days.
Like 2 days, yeah.
2 days.
Whew.
Incredible film, man. So impressed, moved, and it made me think about food in a completely different way. And I think for me, being an athlete, someone who has always viewed food as a performance amplifier, catalyst, and then its impact on body composition. When you're younger, 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s, you don't think of when you're 60, 70, 80, 90, and what the food you were consuming your entire life leading up to that moment is going to result or turn into. This film in itself made me start to think about food choices, me being 70, 80, 90 plus years old, and the impact that's making right now. Was that the goal?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, nutrition is, it's such a powerful tool, and everybody eats, and food is so important. I mean, it's such an important part of the human experience, but insofar as food has the ability to modulate these long-term health outcomes, I think that's crucially important. I think like when we're young, we tend to think of ourselves as invincible, or food as fuel. We take this food as fuel mentality, or how is, the food that I'm eating going to support my gains in the gym or what I see in the mirror. But it does have an impact on our long-term health. And what the research is starting to show is that it also can impact long-term brain health. And our brains are what make everything possible. Our entire experience of life, is facilitated by this, this 2 to 3 pound mass of wetware that sits, inches behind our eyes, between our ears, and we've got to protect that organ. It's super, super important. And what has motivated my life's work is looking specifically at how nutrition and other lifestyle factors modulate brain health. And my call to action was my mom, and somebody who, meant the world to me and got really sick at a really young age. And yeah, I'm just as interested in maximizing gains as much as the rest of us. But yeah, I think nutrition plays a really powerful role, and we're starting to see now the role that it plays in brain health.
I consider myself, in terms of nutrition, like my diet, food choice it's locked in. It's pretty dialed in. It has been for quite some time now. Understanding macronutrients, micronutrients, the sources and quality of foods. Over the last couple of years, I've put more emphasis on the quality of foods more than the quantity, as I did in previous years. And I think there's always room for improvement and things that we can add in. I'm more of a fan of adding things into our diet than taking away, because I found that if you add in the right things, you just naturally eliminate some of the bad things. But I wanted to share this with you. After I finished watching the film, I went on Instacart and I ordered things right away. I ordered like the highest quality olive oil that I could find. I ordered wild caught sardines, a bunch of more like kale and broccoli and vegetables. And just some of the things that you were showcasing. Kimchi. I ordered more kimchi. I go off and on this kimchi saga every once in a while, where I try to get into it and then I do, then I fall off. But I love finding these ways to just incrementally improve and get better. And even though I think my diet is very fundamentally and strong foundationally, there's always things I think we can add in to maybe not only feel better in real time, but to make incremental progress in the future.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think now we live in this era where, people who tend to, the loudest voices in the nutrition space tend to lead with fear. And actually, when I first got started advocating for the role of nutrition and brain health, my first book, Genius Foods, was really, that was the approach that I took, was what are the foods that people can add into their diets that provide nutrients that we know are very supportive of brain health, as evidenced by observational studies, animal studies, and even human randomized controlled trials. And so, whether we're talking like omega-3 fats, DHA fat, for example, certain carotenoids that are found in dark leafy greens like lutein and zeaxanthin, which I think I helped break the news on actually in my first book. We know those compounds are very supportive to eye health, to brain health. I think for most people, it's likely beneficial to think about this in terms of what can I add to my diet. Now, your diet's dialed in, right? Like just looking at you, the 3 key modifiable risk factors that are related to nutrition with regards to dementia risk are obesity. You clearly don't have that. Type 2 diabetes, you very likely don't have that, I'm guessing. And hypertension, So you're doing really well from a dietary standpoint. I would say you've got that all dialed. But for most people, today about 50% of people, almost 50% of people are not just overweight, but obese. So for somebody who is struggling with overweight, what's the thing that you can add in that'll probably help with that condition? Well, probably some more protein, which is the most satiating macronutrient. So, you've got to meet people where they're at. And I think, taking this approach of what can I add in makes the most sense. I think there are some important considerations to make with regard to the standard American diet. I mean, there are obviously lots of aspects of the standard American diet that can be improved. I think we're all likely consuming too much added sugar, ultra-processed foods. We're starting to see now the connection between ultra-processed food intake and myriad negative health outcomes. But I like the approach of taking stock, taking inventory, and seeing where I can improve by making incremental additions to one's diet.
We were just talking about this before we started recording, but you were working on this film for 10-ish years.
Yeah.
How does it feel? I mean, it's a long time to work on a project. This year we're going to celebrate 12 years since I started my business, which has gone fast, but also it's been a long time to work on a film documentary for 10 years. What was that experience like? The highs, the lows, and knowing that it's now releasing to the public in a few days.
Yeah, it's crazy. And unfortunately, after 10 years of working on a documentary, it's not like you're rewarded with some kind of monetary gain, but that was never the intent of the film. The intent of the film really was to pay homage to the science of dementia prevention and to pay tribute to what it was that my mom was going through, that I know millions of other people around the world will find solace in and relate to. But it's incredibly cathartic and gratifying. And, I think a lot of people, I've been doing this for the past decade. And my first book came out in 2018, but I've been working on this project since 2014. So that's, a decade of my life. So I think for anybody that, might follow me on social media or have read my books, or stumble across, one of my YouTube videos, like I never set out to be a quote unquote like influencer. That's not what I am. I'm somebody who saw something, that was profoundly affected by something, happening in their life and decided to take action on it in a way that was, not just sitting idly as whatever was in my mom's fate played out in front of us. I did my best to understand. And this is something that's continuing for me. I'm still trying to understand why it was that my mom, at such a young age, developed what it was that she developed. And
how old was she?
She was 58
when she was diagnosed.
Yeah, when she was diagnosed with some kind of neurodegenerative complex. It was thought to be early on a Parkinsonian condition, which suggesting that it had something to do with Parkinson's, but it wasn't classical Parkinson's disease in the sense that she didn't present with any of the more typical symptoms that we see with Parkinson's disease. she also had cognitive, like profound cognitive dysfunction that began early on. Initially, which she described as brain fog. But I had been a journalist, so I had worked for a TV network in the United States that reached 100 million homes since graduating college. And so I had been an investigator of sorts, and I had studied film in college with a focus on documentary filmmaking. And I'd always been passionate about nutrition and fitness, just sort of as like a personal passion. I've never been an athlete, but I've always, been kind of ambiently interested in the applied science of bodybuilding and the like. Like most guys, but I've never been an athlete. I've never been particularly gifted genetically or otherwise, with athletics. But when my mom became sick, it's like everything else that I had been interested in kind of faded to the background, and I became obsessed with trying to understand why this would have happened to a woman at 58. And because I had been interested in nutrition and I kind of knew where to look for credible primary literature, PubMed and the like, I started to look into the research, and I stumbled upon a few insights that I think really drove this idea to do a documentary and to begin advocating, to a wider audience on behalf of these, more holistic lifestyle changes. And one of them is that dementia begins often decades before the presentation of symptoms.
When I heard that in the film, I think you guys referenced 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
I've probably told a million people that since I've heard that in the film.
Wow.
Like by the time, a million is an exaggeration, but I mean, everyone I've come across so far since finishing that film the last couple of days, I brought up how we're doing this podcast today, and it's all around dementia and Alzheimer's and the fact that once you show symptoms, you could have been developing this disease 20 to 30 years prior to. And that stat for me is what really kind of grabbed me and woke me up. And I felt this obligation to tell everyone around me, it's like, hey, like this is all prevention.
Absolutely.
We have to get out ahead of it.
100%. I mean, millennials now are approaching, if not already in midlife, right? Like I'm a millennial, I just turned 42 years old. Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, it's not the only form, but this is a disease of midlife. Like this is a disease of now with symptoms that appear in late life. So by the time you're diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, or likely any form of dementia for that matter, you're already essentially in the late stage of that disease. Whether it's, you were diagnosed yesterday. I mean, this is a disease that was simmering under the surface for decades.
Is there any other disease similar to that does that?
All non-communicable chronic diseases. I mean, these conditions don't begin overnight. If you have a heart attack, the occlusion of your arteries didn't begin, the night prior to you ending up in the emergency room, right? Parkinson's disease is another condition where by the time you're diagnosed, 50% of the dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra, which is the region of the brain associated with Parkinson's disease, are already dead. So, I mean, yes, that's scary and sad for patients, but it's also, I think, incredibly empowering from the standpoint of prevention, because that means that we have a window of opportunity to intervene, right, to change the course of our destiny. And that's what I think was my goal, actually, for creating the documentary, was to really present novel ideas that had the potential to move the needle on these conditions in a really profound way. And, I started it 10 years ago. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about dementia as a preventable condition. Right now, many people are. But this documentary was really, I mean, I hate to, I'm not the type to pat myself on the back, but this is an idea that 10 years ago you couldn't even say without being called a quack or a charlatan. Dementia as a preventable condition. But now we know, whether it's through modulating our diet or reducing our exposure to air pollution, for example, that this is a potentially preventable condition for most, if not all, people who suffer it. And the key word is potentially. We don't have all the answers, and you can still do, everything quote unquote right and still develop the condition. There is a degree of luck. There is a degree of genetic involvement. But But I think the point that I'm trying to drive home with my work is that we don't need to sit idly. We can take action in our lives.
See, that's where my mindset has shifted since your film is I always assumed and thought dementia was just predisposition, genetic. I've heard people say like, oh, dementia runs in my family. So I'm assuming that at some point in my life, I'm going to also have dementia.
Do you have it in your family tree?
I don't personally.
Well, what's interesting is neither did I. Like my mom's mom did not have dementia at the time of her passing. My maternal grandmother passed at 96 and she was cognitively healthy. And my mom's dad did not have dementia. So, I mean, something that the heritability is low.
Right.
Anybody with a brain is vulnerable. The heritability for Parkinson's disease is very low. 2 to 3% in both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. I mean, we have genetic risk factors, but these are not deterministic genes that we're talking about.
Do you think those genes are pretty strong though? Like if it does run in your family, you are highly likely, or is that we can modify that likeliness with things like diet?
We can modify the likelihood for sure. Because, I have a genetic risk factor. My mom had the genetic risk factor. I inherited it likely from my mom, possibly from my dad, but these are just risk genes. And there is data suggesting that in other parts of the world where the prevalence, for example, of these genotypes are just as high as they are here in the United States, disease prevalence is relatively low. And the same genes that in the United States, for example, might put a person at, double or even higher of a risk as compared to a non-carrier. In other parts of the world, that gene seems to have little to no association with the condition. So basically what that suggests is if you're genetically at risk for Alzheimer's disease, for example, in the United States, you might simply move to a less industrialized part of the world and see that risk abolished.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, so they've shown in southern Italy, I believe, in Ibadan, Nigeria, there are ApoE4 carrier. ApoE4 is the most prevalent and well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene. That gene exists throughout the world. But in other parts of the world, parts of the world that haven't been exposed yet to the standard American diet, that gene doesn't seem to have the same degree of influence on health outcomes.
What concentrations of the world have the most individuals or population with dementia, Alzheimer's, as opposed to like where is the least concentration of people?
Well, generally, any part of the world where the diet has become westernized, we see higher prevalence. But also it's important to acknowledge that diet isn't the only variable. So there's growing research showing that air pollution is related to Alzheimer's disease etiology. They've shown in Mexico City, for example, they've looked at the brains of cadavers across the age spectrum, young people, adolescents and children who've been exposed to high levels of air pollution, that they have very similar pathology in their brains as you might see in somebody with early Alzheimer's disease. Aggregation of amyloid plaque, for example. So nutrition isn't the only variable, which makes a lot of this kind of research difficult to do. Social isolation we know is another modifiable risk factor. But generally, westernized parts of the world are where you see the highest prevalence. For example, there's research showing that Japanese nationals, for example, when they move to the United States, their risk dramatically increases. So it's, taking somebody and then exposing them to the standard American diet and lifestyle seems to increase risk dramatically. So it seems to have something to do with the standard American diet and lifestyle. And I think it's clear that, we live amid an obesogenic food environment. We've inherited a food environment that seems to promote insulin resistance via myriad mechanisms. I think diet plays a huge role, but it's also exposure to environmental toxins like bisphenols and, any number of forever chemicals that have been shown to influence insulin signaling in the body. So it's multifactorial, but yeah, diet. I mean, diet plays a huge role. So, and this is a dietary pattern that we've now exported around the world. So I think, there's research suggesting that numbers are expected to explode in the coming years. I think 55 million people as of today worldwide suffer from dementia. And we're expected to see those numbers triple in the coming decades.
Are we seeing people showing signs of dementia earlier than before? Or is it just overall we're seeing more numbers of people?
Yeah. So that's something that was really fascinating that we discuss in the film, actually. One of the interviewees in my documentary is a Brown University researcher named Suzanne Delamonte.
She was great.
She was great, right?
She was great.
So I think a lot of people today have kind of heard ambiently this concept of type 3 diabetes, that Alzheimer's disease may, in a way, be a form of diabetes of the brain.
That was the first time I've heard that, actually.
That was the first time?
That was the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I like hearing that was the first time, because that shows that this idea still is relatively shrouded, and so that's cool to hear. This researcher coined the term type 3 diabetes. She's a neuropathologist at Brown, and she also has a master's in public health. And so what she talks about in our film is that we're seeing rates increase across the age spectrum. So these aren't just in the old that we're seeing numbers increase. We're seeing it increase, 50s, 60s, 70s. So there's definitely an environmental trigger. And it makes sense, because when you look at, again, these modifiable risk factors. So when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, you've got, let me just explain what that means. So, you have what are called your non-modifiable risk factors and your modifiable risk factors. Modifiable suggests that we have influence, we have agency, right? Our non-modifiable risk factors are generally age, gender, and genetics. You can't change your genes, although you can influence how your genes express themselves. It's known as epigenetics. We have gender. You can't change your gender. Women are at double the risk as compared to men. And then you have age. So age is still the number one risk factor. But as Dr. Delamonte discusses in the film, we're seeing incidence increase across the age spectrum. Obviously, it's very rare in very young people, but 50s, 60s, and beyond, we are apparently seeing rates increase. And then among the modifiable risk factors, you have about a dozen or so, but obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes we'll just take those, right? We're seeing rates of obesity, which is a risk factor, increase. We're seeing rates of type 2 diabetes increase. We're seeing hypertension increase. 50% of adults today, as I mentioned, are essentially obese. Also, 50% of adults today have hypertension, which is high blood pressure. We're seeing insulin resistance increase. Today, now, I think, 50% of adults have either type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, which is essentially early stage type 2 diabetes.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. And so, those are all increasing in their prevalence. So how it would be, it doesn't take a stretch of logic to imagine how rates of these related conditions like Alzheimer's disease are also increasing in their prevalence.
Something that I still don't fully understand and would love to learn more and have you break it down. From my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, dementia is kind of the general diagnosis of the degeneration of neurons in the brain. What is the difference between just like a general diagnosis of dementia and then, say, Parkinson's, like your mom had Lewy bodies, and then Alzheimer's? Like how do those differentiate, and what makes them unique?
Yeah, so you're totally right. Dementia is the umbrella term for neurodegeneration, with the primary impact being on cognitive function. So how we think, how we perceive the world, how we're able to respond to things, memory function, processing speed, executive function, all of those domains are affected by dementia. And underneath the umbrella of dementia, you have Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia. That affects about 6 million people in the United States today. But then you have less common forms like vascular dementia. Vascular dementia is the second most common form, which is essentially degeneration of the blood vessels that supply blood, nutrients, oxygen to the brain. Then you have frontotemporal dementia, which is very rare. That's been in the news recently because, unfortunately, Bruce Willis, he suffers from that condition, which, a huge Bruce Willis fan. But I guess the one silver lining is that it's brought awareness to this condition and the relative dearth of research surrounding it, and just how badly we need more research on these more rare forms. And then you have Lewy body dementia, which is what my mom suffered from, which is like having Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at the same time. But that has more in common with Parkinson's. So Parkinson's disease is not dementia. Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder. And it specifically affects the substantia nigra region of the brain, which is a very small region of the brain that is home to dopamine-producing neurons that mediate movement. And for somebody with Parkinson's disease, the primary symptom is movement-related. But even within the bucket of Parkinson's disease and related conditions, Parkinson's disease for many patients in its late stages will progress to Parkinson's disease dementia. So because it's a neurodegenerative condition, ultimately many people with Parkinson's disease will develop cognitive dysfunction. Parkinson's disease typically doesn't present with so you can be you're cognitively totally healthy. You just have these movement symptoms. But then there's Lewy body dementia, which is basically having Parkinson's disease with the cognitive dysfunction at the outset, which is what my mom developed.
That's tough.
Yeah, and it's also what Robin Williams had, and it's thought to lead to worse health outcomes. So it's a very, very difficult disease. And that has more in common with Parkinson's disease than it does Alzheimer's disease. So you've got all of these different conditions, and they're all distinct. And even within the conditions themselves, there's this saying in neurology that once you've seen one case of dementia, you've seen one case of dementia. So they all present a little bit differently, and then they're distinct from one another in these different, in terms of the pathophysiology and in terms of the symptomology. But yeah, I'm of the belief that what's good for the brain is good for the brain. And though most of the research tends to focus on Alzheimer's disease, and just generalized all-cause dementia, I think that by following, a brain-healthy diet, by reducing your exposure to environmental toxins, I think it's likely we'll see in the future that we could potentially reduce our risk for all of these different conditions, which is just a speculation, of course, but yeah, I'm hopeful that that ultimately we'll see that nobody needs to suffer from dementia.
Yeah. So I came across a lot of your content from the books and the podcast, and I just assumed that you just kind of fell into the space because you just explored a passion in health, performance optimization, fitness. But really, it was because your mom was diagnosed with Lewy bodies, and I guess before that, it was just some sort of cognitive decline. But a lot of it was learning from firsthand experience, going to the doctor's appointments with her, the tests, the research. I think I heard you say you've read thousands of peer-reviewed literature papers. So really, you were submerged and kind of found your passion in the space from firsthand experience through this awful disease your mom was going through, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not a medical doctor, and I didn't take an academic path. And, that'll cause some people to disregard anything I have to say right off the bat, right? But my credential is my lived experience and the passion that I have for understanding what it was that took my mom from me, and my desire to help, reduce suffering in the world, particularly with these kinds of conditions. And yeah, I've read thousands of papers at this point, and it wasn't easy at first. I didn't go through the academic channels, but anybody with a sick loved one, it's something that anybody with a sick loved one will certainly relate to. It's just it motivates you in a way that nothing else can, and also at a certain point, I realized that I had something that very few civilians have, and that is I had media credentials. back at the outset of this journey. And so I use those credentials to my advantage because, as I mentioned, I used to have essentially a TV show that reached 100 million homes. So I'd been a journalist on TV, and I use those credentials to my advantage. And of course, undertaking this documentary project also was like a calling card that I used to email the researchers whose work I had been reading, and it has allowed me subsequently to be in the room and have a seat at the table, essentially, with people whose whole academic careers have been dedicated to advancing this field known as dementia prevention. I've actually even also gotten to co-author a textbook chapter on the topic of dementia prevention, the clinical practice of dementia prevention, which is used to teach healthcare practitioners, doctors, medical doctors, about the steps that we can take as clinicians to help reduce risk in patients. So it's been an incredible journey, but part of that for me is I think it's crucially important to have integrity no matter what it is that you're doing. But one thing for me that is really important is to never mislead people about my background. My background is that I had an incredibly sick. I've seen true sickness, which is not something that I think many people in our space can say for themselves. I've been to cathedrals to Western medicine, right? Like academic insight. And in those instances with a sick loved one, it's just like there's such a dearth of options.
Do you get a lot of pushback for not having medical credentials?
I don't really. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that I don't portray myself as somebody, who has medical credentials or who knows everything. And I try to be always, as upfront as possible about what I know and what I don't know. And I'm always, I am always willing to share with my audience where I've changed my mind, where I've evolved my view on things. I heard somebody say, so I was giving a talk recently in Atlanta, and somebody asked me how to identify somebody with integrity and somebody, who is like, how to identify who's really presenting honest information today on social media. Because today everybody has a voice and there are a lot of dissenting viewpoints, and it can be really overwhelming, right? Like who to trust.
Yeah, voice and narrative.
Exactly. And something that I think one thing that I intuitively do, or at least I try to do, that they thought was like I think this person who had asked me the question, they brought up that they had heard this on a podcast or something. They were like, somebody who's generally an expert and who's trustworthy, generally will also present the opposing viewpoint to their argument, and they won't straw man that opposing viewpoint, they'll steel man it. So rather than misrepresenting the opposing viewpoint, they will make the opposing viewpoint as clear as possible and as authentic as possible, and then present the counter argument to that viewpoint. And that's something that it's an interesting way to think about expertise and honesty in our space, where nutrition science generally is incredibly weak. But I feel like I do, in a way, try to present opposing viewpoints to my ideas.
I think it's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
So many people will oftentimes take that as a lack of confidence in your own perspective.
Yeah.
But the right people who understand, you gain their confidence because you're showing both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
Because there's not one perfect example of this is the only way. There's always going to be opposition for everything.
Exactly. And we, on social media today, I hate to keep talking about social media because it sounds so trite, but I mean, it is a prevalent part of modern life, and it is where a lot of people get their nutrition or just general health information from. And even among those that have seemingly rock solid credentials, I mean, there's so much arrogance in the space. I mean, everybody's got like a different, magic morning routine or protocol, and that's generally not how science works. I mean, science is a process. It's very rarely, particularly in our space, like nutrition, it's so seldom the case that the science is ever settled. And I think that's really important to always couch your advice, recommendations, whatever it is that you're talking about, in, to always have a degree to leave room for uncertainty.
Yeah. I've gained a lot of respect for a lot of people recently who have been in this space for a long time, and they'll launch a video, a podcast, or a book talking about how and what they've changed their mind on over the years. Because you don't see that very often. You'll see someone, they'll have a narrative and a point they're trying to drive home, even when all the science and literature and studies are pushing against it. They still stand strong with that ego. But when I hear people say, hey, I was wrong here before, I've changed my mind about this, they gain a lot of respect in my book. And I've also learned a whole lot more from people who don't have the credentials than who do have the credentials. I've realized like a lot of the people that I look to for information, they're not the doctors, they're not the scientists. They're people who are truly passionate about something, and they will go to extensive lengths to research everything, to learn and then share that information because they feel obligated to not hold that to themselves, but to spread the love and knowledge.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've become good friends with the Mind Pump guys. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Yeah.
One of my homies, Sal DiStefano, over there. I mean, he's one of the most brilliant.
We had Sal on the podcast.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's a personal trainer with 20 years of experience, but he's like me. He's not a medical doctor. He's not a PhD in in nutrition. But I mean, that guy, he's a walking encyclopedia. And so yeah, I have a ton of respect for people in the space that have whose credential again hasn't been bestowed upon them by academia, but in fact real life. And I know that there is a certain degree of caution that needs to be, we need to have caution when believing any, somebody, credentialed or not, but generally, the odds are higher that somebody with credentials is going to know, to some degree at least, what it is that they're talking about. And today there is a lot of noise on social media, and some of that noise can be potentially harmful. So we do have to be careful. But again, I think, a lot can be gleaned from the languaging around these topics, and you generally want to, you want to stick with people who couch what it is that they're talking about with uncertainty, with humility, and leave room for the science to change. When I wrote my first book, Genius Foods, I got to work with a brilliant medical doctor, an obesity medicine specialist named Paul Graywall, and we had tons of conversations about how important it was to both of us that the book stood the test of time, that were a study to come out tomorrow overturning some of these ideas. We would still want the book to be a truthful portrayal of the science, and to this day, I mean, the book continues to be as evidence-based as it was 8 years ago when I wrote it.
Right. One thing I'm curious about, you worked on this film for 10 years. As your mom continued to get sicker and decline, how hard was it to maintain the work on the film while she kept getting sicker? It's a long project. And as a creator myself, sometimes pulling out the camera and documenting certain parts are very challenging or just didn't feel like the right time or place. How'd you maintain that motivation to keep the content and the documentation of that whole process going?
Yeah, it was hard, man. I mean, at times incredibly difficult, but I think it was just really important to me at the time to see this vision through, and as an artist because I mean, dude, the toll that it was taking on me, I mean, I distinctly remember, and the rest of my family was, I mean, it was such a profound burden of stress. I mean, that's one of the things about dementia is that it's a caregiver's disease as much as it is anything else. I mean, it's so hard for the family members. And I could see, like, I barely recognize myself when I watch the film because of what it was that we were all collectively going through. You know, watching the most important person in our lives essentially disintegrate in front of our eyes. And so for me, I think as an artist, it was just really important to transmute that pain into something meaningful, because I think in a way I knew, maybe not consciously, but that if I hadn't, that it would have taken my life or led to some pretty, unfortunate mental health toll had I had not. You know, I also remember during that time really prioritizing self-care, which can feel difficult. You know, like when you have a sick loved one, every cell in your body wants to spend as much time as possible with that person. But I continued to work out and pursue my own vision of wellness throughout that time. I remember routinely saunaing as much as I could, and just because, like, you've got to, it sounds trite, but you've got to put your oxygen mask on first. You know, if you dedicate yourself so selflessly to the cause, then ultimately it's going to have an impact on you, and you're not going to be able to show up as the best version of yourself. And that's what your loved one in those moments needs the most, is the best version of you. And so self-care was really important, but also I think for me as an artist, documenting and turning what it was that I was going through into some kind of art piece that lent the entire experience a degree of meaning. And like songwriters, for example, they go through an awful breakup, they write songs about it. And it's a way for them to, not maybe become alcoholics or off themselves. And for me, there were moments that were incredibly dark. I had foregone my career early on in the documentary. We, kind of portray how I had given up a lot of my life in Los Angeles, certainly, a major aspect of my career by moving back from LA to New York to be closer to my mom. And so it was a pretty dark time in my life. And I think, like, between the self-care, continuing to do that, and by documenting it, it was a way for me to kind of look after my own sovereignty in those moments.
Well, some of the moments you captured, which I can imagine being really difficult in the moment to capture, are the moments that really drove the impact and meaning and influence of that film, for me at least. Like that one part of the film where your mom was stuck in the bathroom and she couldn't figure out how to open the door to get out. And just from the point of view of you filming, camera in front of you, it felt so real and in the moment, because it was. That's where it really was like, oh man, like this is a thing. And people are going through this right now, and I could be going through this in the future. My family could be going through this in the future. Like this is not just like this documentary that is educating, but we're along for the journey and feeling the raw emotion. But those moments you picking up the camera and documenting that, in my opinion, that's what made the film so powerful.
Yeah, those are incredibly difficult moments. And like, I cringe seeing myself in some of those scenes, because I can detect a frustration and an impatience. And yeah, like I don't even know who I was in those moments, like I wanna, when I watch the film, my experience of it is I wanna reach through the screen and like grab that version of Max by the neck and yell at him to be more, to just relax, to be more patient in those moments. But when you're actually experiencing dementia, it's an incredibly frustrating experience. I mean, you think that the person, often I would think that my mom was trolling me, that like I was being punked. Like, how you're telling me that my mom, the brilliant woman that I know to be my mom, can't read something or recall what she had just written on a piece of paper seconds prior to my asking her what it is that she just wrote.
I remember that part. I could feel the frustration in your voice during that part.
Yeah. I was like, just read it. And I hear myself say that now, and I'm like, oh my God, like I was like really frustrated in that moment. And that's why we kept those scenes in the film, because this film is not about it's not about making me out to look like some kind of like savior. It's about portraying the reality of dementia and how hard it is for families to go through. And yeah, I mean, it was incredibly difficult. But my mom was she, as you could probably tell, there was a part of her that liked being in front of the camera. I mean, she was totally gung ho, and I think deep down she kind of knew that ultimately this would, because my mom loved people, she loved humanity, and she had dedicated her life in many ways to reducing suffering in the world. Not professionally, but she was an activist in many ways, and so I think in a way she recognized that this project had the potential to maybe help others, and so yeah.
She seemed like she was all about it.
She was about it, yeah.
She's a good character for the film.
Yeah, she's so charismatic, and one thing that's really interesting, and I think that sets my experience apart and makes the film different, I think, from other dementia films. It actually is what has made my journey and my mom's journey certainly exponentially more difficult, but I think in a way is going to help the film make a greater impact, is that my mom was acutely aware of the challenges that she was having and the fact that this condition was really robbing her of so much of what it was of who she was and what she loved to do in life. With Alzheimer's disease, and this is what I've learned again as a non-clinician, but I've had the privilege of getting to screen the film at theaters around the U.S. now at this point, and I've had people come up to me after the screenings and share that for oftentimes patients with Alzheimer's disease, they're not as aware of what it is that they're experiencing. It's usually the family members that have to bring their loved ones to make that first appointment with the neurologist. Oftentimes patients with Alzheimer's disease, they're not aware of the cognitive changes that are happening. But with in my mom's case, she was acutely aware. And I think it made the whole experience for all of us that much worse because of the suffering involved, because of the awareness of what it was that she was going through.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the way I've always viewed and thought dementia existed is that you just didn't know you had dementia. You just started declining. Everyone else around you was seeing it and feeling it, but the person who actually had the disease wasn't. And that's also why it really, that film became so emotional for me to watch, is because you could see your mom realizing that she was declining and she was almost losing hope to continue forward because she knew it was just getting worse. It's like seeing that was really tough to, just from an outsider, tough to watch and experience, because it's just gonna get worse. It's not getting any better.
Yeah. And it really only got worse. I mean, I think exercise was I think helpful in many ways. We got my mom to work with a personal trainer, and my mom's of a generation where I think fitness was often an afterthought, and we got my mom set up with a personal trainer, and I think the exercise helped lift her spirits in many ways. There's a great scene in the film where she's, we got my mom working out, but
yeah, trainer was a vibe.
Yeah, trainer was a vibe. Yeah,
it was a vibe.
Yeah, people love him, and he was very sweet. And I think his name was Joe. Yeah, Joseph the Body in New York. I don't know if he's still. Hopefully, I'm sure he's still training, but he was great, and yeah, that helped for sure. But it really only got worse, and that's kind of the reality of dementia. There is no magic bullet. Like nobody has yet survived Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's. We don't have a cure for these conditions. That's why prevention is so crucially important. And I don't think it's possible that once the disease has been diagnosed, that we will be able to reverse the condition, because it tends to be diagnosed late. But if we can find that biomarker, that, I mean, this is where the science needs to. This is where I'm incredibly hopeful, and I'm such a big advocate for research and continuing to funnel funds into these various research pipelines. If we can find that biomarker or whatever it is, earlier in life, for somebody that we know 10 years, 20 years down the line might receive that diagnosis. That's the point at which I think, an intervention can be really effective. And the research is starting to show that, whether it's reducing high blood pressure, or, managing your blood sugar. There's research now, they're looking at, these peptides like semaglutide as a means of, and semaglutide is this really controversial drug, but it's revolutionary with regards to weight loss. There is some evidence that it might, because it helps to reduce blood sugar. It's been used for a few decades, I believe, at this point as a type 2 diabetes drug. They're now seeing if it might potentially play a preventative role in Alzheimer's disease. Now, I don't think a drug should ever be the first line defense, but for people who have exhausted all other options, and it's sort of like a Hail Mary intervention, then that gives me hope.
So once you're diagnosed, like we already talked about, that chronic inflammation in the brain has probably been going on for 20 to 30 years, potentially multiple decades prior to diagnosis. You can't reverse it, but once it's identified, can you improve it?
I think you can slow it, and I think you can potentially improve it, but there's no getting around the fact that it's a degenerative condition, that it ultimately will degenerate. Now, there are other forms of cognitive impairment that might potentially be reversed, like mild cognitive impairment, subjective cognitive impairment. Those conditions are not dementia. Alzheimer's disease, I don't believe that once that's diagnosed that it can be reversed, but I do think that that we can potentially improve, for example, quality of life. I think that we can improve some of the symptoms, or, some of the related symptoms, and I do believe that we can slow it. And I think the key to slowing it is multimodal. So it's not just, eating a handful of blueberries once a week. I think it's, a dietary intervention. I think it's going to involve exercise, stress management, optimizing sleep and circadian rhythms, which become dysregulated in many of these conditions, reducing exposure to environmental toxicants. So, yeah, I do think it can be slowed. And there is some, new evidence emerging that suggests that this is in fact the case. But there is no silver bullet. It's going to take, I think, a holistic approach.
But what's causing all this degeneration of the brain is this slow burn of inflammation in the brain, correct?
Yeah.
And that's being caused by, I'm assuming, bad diet leading to reduced blood flow to the brain, toxins. This inflammation, what's it look like? What's it feel like? What do you think is really driving it?
Yeah, so I think there are likely different causes for each person, but inflammation definitely plays a role, chronic inflammation in the brain. Inflammation is not bad. It's an important feature of our immune systems, right? But when it's chronic, when it's low grade, I think, that's clearly very damaging. So I think for many people, there are different avenues to dementia. I think for some, it could be the chronically high blood sugar that literally is like scorching blood vessels from the inside, right? Causing the formation of advanced glycation end products inside of our blood vessels. There could be, occlusion due to, different features, like, for example, atherosclerosis. We know that what's good for the heart is good for the brain, and conversely, what's bad for the heart is bad for the brain. What's bad for our blood vessels is bad for the brain. But we now are also starting to see that it's exposure to environmental pollutants, toxicants. There's a researcher at University of Rochester. He's a neurologist who's published a lot on certain environmental toxicants, like certain herbicides and pesticides, and certain industrial solvents like trichloroethylene, which is still being used in dry cleaning applications and as a solvent used to clean electronics, and how these compounds might act as really specific mitochondrial toxins that enter the brain through the nose. The nose is essentially the front door to the brain. And so exposure to these compounds occupationally, but not even occupationally, through just our environment, environmental exposures to these compounds, which are now ubiquitous in the environment, might actually be causing these conditions for many people. My mom, for example, and I'll never know what caused my mom's condition. It could have had something to do with nutrition. It could have had nothing to do with nutrition. My mom worked in the garment center. So my mom was a clothing manufacturer in New York City for much of her life. And, a compound like trichloroethylene was used in manufacturing and in dry cleaning for many decades. It still is. And this compound, we have evidence to suggest that it's a profound mitochondrial toxin. And mitochondrial dysfunction is potentially the root cause, is at the root cause of many of these conditions that we're talking about: Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. So for some, it might be exposure to these kinds of compounds. Trichloroethylene, for example, the U.S. is the #1 exporter still of this chemical. It's used as a metal degreaser, but up until the 70s, it was used medically. It was used to decaffeinate coffee. It was used as a solvent to extract vegetable oils, believe it or not. And usually exposure to these compounds doesn't create Parkinson's disease overnight. It takes decades. And so it could have been the case that my mom was exposed to this compound, which is what caused her condition. So it's I hate to appeal to nature, but I really do think that eating a diet that's primarily comprised of whole foods, organic when we're eating the whole skin or the peel of the fruit or the produce or whatever it is, the leaf, for example, reducing our exposure to these industrial toxicants, I think worthwhile. And it's not alarmist to say that. It's bringing awareness, I think, to these different variables.
Do you ever come across people who say, or might be hearing this, and they're like, well, it sounds like at some point in my life I'm going to be exposed to all of these things, so why even try to make a change?
Well, because we're resilient creatures, right? But our bodies can only contend with so much. Today, it's like cumulative injury. Our cup runneth over of exposures, whether it's exposure to a sedentary lifestyle, exposure to the standard American food environment, right? So you're somebody who, you eat a healthful diet, but you also travel a lot, exposing you to, who knows, disruption in the microbiome, to volatile organic compounds when you're sitting on the jet, in the jet on the runway. But your body is resilient. Your body has these detoxification pathways, right? Honed over millennia of Darwinian evolution, right? But you have to, the onus is on you to A, become aware of this fact, and B, to make sure that you're feeding yourself the appropriate raw materials to support these pathways. So a diet rich in protein, a diet rich in compounds like cysteine, which helps with glutathione production in the body, which is the body's master detoxifier, right? This isn't like a magic silver bullet, and you don't have to go out. This isn't like a recommendation to buy supplements. It's just like eat a whole foods diet, that has, ample animal source foods and plant-based foods, cruciferous vegetables, which stimulate your body's detox pathways. So your body is resilient. So it's giving your body the raw materials to be able to undergo these various detoxification programs, and then to reduce your exposure as best you can to the insults, right? I'm not saying you have to be Amish and move to rural America and forego the trappings and the comforts of modern society. I certainly don't do that. I live in a big city. I travel all the time. When I'm at an airport and I'm thirsty, I drink water out of plastic, right? But I think with increased awareness, we can do incrementally better. We can do a little bit better today than we did yesterday. And I think it's meaningful,
Yeah. I do appreciate that you approach diet from this omnivore, holistic approach, and that's the same way that I eat. And it's almost becoming a rarity now where someone's actually an omnivore anymore, because they're either all in on plants or all in on meat. And like there's less and less people right there in the middle. So if we're thinking about this from a big picture perspective, the goal is to not be obese, maintain body weight, reduce risk and avoid prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, maintain a level of fitness and activity, movement. In terms of diet itself, like for some really key takeaways, I'm sure you could probably pull from like Genius Foods, some of those foods you've identified. What are the items that you recommend people, or the foods you recommend people to get into their diet, which I would assume would naturally eliminate some of these other ultra processed foods that they're already consuming?
Yeah, so I'll list off a few of the foods that I think are really important, and I'll present them in no particular order, because I feel like whatever food I say first, people are going to say, "Oh, Max is like saying that we need to like base our diet around that food," which isn't the case. But I routinely go to bat for grass-fed, grass-finished red meat. I think red meat's a health food, and I believe this well before I had any kind of relationship with producers of grass-fed, grass-finished meat, which I'm very lucky that I now have, that supply me with the kinds of meat that I eat and feed my family. But I mean, it's not controversial that this is one of the most nutrient dense foods that exists. And first of all, we need to stop demonizing any whole food, regardless of your dietary tribe. If you're, if somebody's out there demonizing a whole food in a time when most of the calories that your average person is ingesting comes from ultra processed foods, then I think that person, you're listening to the wrong people.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy, like to demonize any whole food, plant or animal.
I mean, people are afraid to eat anything at this point.
It's wild. Yeah. Those memes on social media where it's like, you hear all these like different fear-mongering voices, and then what the person's left with is like a bowl of ice.
Yep.
It's crazy.
But it's true.
Yeah, it is true.
It's true.
And I have empathy for your average consumer. And it comes from both camps. I mean, it comes from now the growing carnivore community who are afraid of broccoli. And then, of course, vegans who have been at it for much longer. So they're actually the pros in that regard. But yeah, so I think red meat is a health food, and it's loaded with nutrients that we know are supportive of brain health: creatine, carnitine, carnosine, choline. Super important. I think eggs are a cognitive multivitamin. Dietary cholesterol has essentially no downside with regards to cardiovascular risk. I mean, there are always going to be exceptions to the rule, but for most people, dietary cholesterol is not a major concern. And eggs have a lot more benefits than they do risk. They're the top source of choline, which is a really important nutrient with regards to brain health. About 90% of adults do not meet the adequate intake for choline on a daily basis. It's really important for pregnant women. It's a really powerful brain nutrient. It provides the backbone precursor molecule to acetylcholine, which is important for learning and memory. And it also helps to form the phospholipid bilayer, which is essentially the membrane that protects our neurons and allows our neurons to communicate with neighboring neurons.
I love good eggs.
Yeah, eggs are amazing.
There's this, we were living in Nashville for 9 months, and we moved back to Texas a few months ago. And the first thing I ordered were these eggs from this local farm called Shirtail Creek. They do grass-fed, grass-finished beef, pasture-raised eggs, and then pasture-raised chicken. But the farmer, Sam, actually posts a video of his farm, his chickens, every morning. And it's this big open pasture. The chickens are running everywhere. The eggs are the orangest, most buttery tasting eggs you can ever have in your life. I'll go through cartons of eggs. But I know eggs are just so dense in vitamins and minerals and choline, like you said. Grass-fed meats and eggs are like the staples of my everyday diet. It's like a non-negotiable.
Same. Yeah, I mean, think about it. An egg yolk has to contain a little bit of everything that nature has deemed important to grow a brain. So, I mean, it literally is a cognitive multivitamin.
Yeah, true.
A chicken brain, but a brain nonetheless. And so I'm a huge fan. There was a study that just found one study, but linking egg consumption with 50% reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease in a population of about 1,300 people, I believe. Egg consumers compared to non-consumers, so one or more eggs per week. And other research has linked increased choline intake also with reduced risk.
Do you ever share this stuff and then people change their diet to just eat, like 80-20 meat all day and then a dozen eggs a day? And I'm sure that's not what you're saying, but it's incorporating these into your diet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've gotten many people off of vegan diets, like plant-only diets, and I've had amazing feedback from it. Like, women who have gotten their periods back, who've been on these super restrictive plant-based diets, and eating more red meat, more eggs, and they report to me that they've never felt better. They've gotten their periods back, and brain fog has lifted. And I'm not a clinician, so I don't have that. I'll never have that one-to-one patient interaction. But at this point, for a decade now, my books have been out. People have adopted my work, and so I do get a fair amount of feedback from people. And yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer, no pun intended, that these foods are going to be supportive. And like the science demonizing them, the research that people use to make such decisive decisions with their diets and to like take eggs off and beef off the table. It's such weak research, and yet people will use that kind of research to make decisions about the foods that they not just eat themselves, but feed their families. And to me, it's such a tragedy.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree. So red meat, eggs, I think are great. But then also, I'm a huge fan of dark leafy greens. I think dark leafy greens are great. I think cruciferous vegetables are awesome. Now, with plants, it's a little bit interesting because people have different tolerances to different plants, right? Like red meat intolerance is incredibly rare. There are certain complications of Lyme disease, like alpha-gal syndrome, for example, where people will become sensitive to consuming red meat. But in general, the consumption of red meat is very well tolerated, provided you have ample, adequate stomach acid and the like. But it's the produce section really where people have these different tolerances and sensitivities and things like that typically. So I don't make a one-size-fits-all dietary recommendation. If you feel better without broccoli, for example, in your diet, then listen to your body. But I will say that people are a lot more adaptable, individually and as a species, as we tend to give ourselves credit for. And for somebody who overnight starts eating a ton of fiber or broccoli because they've heard that broccoli is good for you on a podcast, that's going to lead to digestive discomfort. Like, you've got to titrate your dose of these plant compounds up slowly to let your microbiome adapt and adjust. And eventually it's going to be not a problem. But yeah, I think people forget that we're incredibly adaptable as a species. And so they have one bad meal, or they eat, from one day to the next, they dramatically increase their fiber intake and they feel bloated and whatever. And they think, oh my God, fiber is the worst thing. But that's just not, you got to slowly increase and stick with it, and your body adapts.
Yeah, you go from 0 to a pound of raw broccoli.
Yeah, it's not good.
Do you typically cook down your vegetables, or you do them raw?
No, I cook them. I think eating raw here and there, a little bit of diversity, I think that's probably beneficial. Because, for example, one of the compounds in cruciferous vegetables that has been shown to help the body more effectively excrete some of these environmental pollutants, sulforaphane, which you might have heard of. That's created when we chew the broccoli, and it's created due to the uniting of two distinct compounds in the broccoli, which are held in different cellular compartments. So you've got glucosinolates in cruciferous vegetables, and then you've got an enzyme called myrosinase. And when you chew raw broccoli, those two chemicals interact, it's an enzymatic conversion that creates sulforaphane. When you cook cruciferous vegetables, you're essentially destroying myrosinase, which is that enzyme. And so you kind of lose some of that detoxification, capability of the cruciferous vegetables.
And does that act as a binder and carries toxins out of the body?
It doesn't carry toxins out of the body. That's what fiber does. Fiber can help do that. It's one of the reasons why we think fiber intake seems to be associated with longevity. Fiber sequesters bile acids. And in those bile acids, you've got lipids, you've got toxins that are released from the liver into the gut. And so fiber actually traps those compounds by way of trapping bile acids, and then we poop them out, which is why, pooping, peeing, and sweating, those are the major routes of detoxification, also breathing to some degree. But that's one of the reasons why fiber is so great, and one of the mechanisms by which we think fiber leads to, lower levels of inflammation, increased lifespan, health span, and the like. But no, sulforaphane works via a different pathway. Sulforaphane is I believe it stimulates the body's NRF2 pathway, which is like this detoxification genetic pathway that upregulates production of glutathione, because it is in a way a toxin. So some of the benefits that we get from plants are due to the ingestion of these hormetic stressors, these what are sometimes referred to as insect, like endogenous pesticides that the plants create. And so they actually stimulate a protective, like a low dose of them stimulates a protective response in the body that causes us to increase production of glutathione and all these other catalase, all these other all these detoxification compounds that our own bodies naturally make. But if you're not feeding yourself the appropriate raw materials, so for example, glycine is rate limiting with regard to glutathione production. So, I think, eating more glycine, eating more collagenous tissue, collagen as a supplement, maybe even, cysteine is also important. And so, so sulforaphane works on a different pathway than fiber. But those are the reasons why I think fruits and vegetables continue to be beneficial from the standpoint of health, especially today.
Yeah. One thing we've been doing recently, we love farmers markets. So what we'll do is we're doing this in Nashville, we're doing this here in Austin now. Both two cities with farmers markets that absolutely incredible. Ranchers come in from everywhere. And we'll go to the farmers market on a Saturday and we'll buy all of our fresh produce, fruits, vegetables. We'll get our meat, we'll get our eggs, we'll get our chicken, pork, like everything. But we'll load up on fruits and vegetables, and we'll make it this game where we have to finish all those fruits and vegetables in the next 7 days. So we'll try all these different things, if there's a different color of cauliflower that week. We recently just found purple cauliflower. So we're trying to get all these different colors in, but we'll load up our vegetables in the beginning of the week and then make sure we consume them throughout that week. That's something that's helped us get more kind of produce in our diet, and especially these dark, leafy green vegetables. Because before we were doing that, it's we had some broccoli laying around, or we have maybe a salad we'll do at night. We load up one day. Me and my wife are okay, we have to strategically plan how we're getting all these in by the next Saturday, because we know we're going to load back up again. So that's something we've been doing recently.
Yeah, I love that. I think again, as long as you're the heuristic is whole foods, and within that bucket of whole foods, dietary preference reigns supreme. But whole food, if you're shopping around the perimeter of your supermarket, inevitably some fruits and vegetables are going to end up in your shopping cart. Meat, eggs, fish, what have you, are going to end up in your shopping cart. And I think change it up. It's not like you have to eat broccoli with every meal. And if you don't like broccoli, well, try purple cauliflower. Purple cauliflower is awesome. It's
so good.
Yeah, and you also get a hit of anthocyanins, which are the same pigments found in blueberries, found in red onions, purple potatoes, that we know support brain health. There is literal evidence scientific evidence showing us that these blue and purple plant pigments accumulate in the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, where they help to lower oxidative stress and the like. So, I mean, you get like a 1-2 punch with purple cauliflower, you know? So you can kind of change it up and mix and match. And, you know, ultimately it comes down to personal preference. Like, I don't force any one food on anybody. But yeah, I love that. It's a great strategy.
We're a huge purple sweet potato family.
That's awesome.
Huge purple sweet potato family. I mean, sometimes we can't find them in the grocery store, so I'll order them online and have them shipped in like 5-pound buckets. But that's one of those foods that as you're biting into it, you can almost like feel the nutrition filling your body. It's the association with the color, the density, the flavor. But yeah, we crush purple sweet potatoes.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, you know, great source of potassium, good source of carbs. Like, purple sweet potatoes are great. They eat them in parts of the world that are associated with longevity.
I think they're really the Japanese culture consumes a lot of them.
Yeah, in Okinawa.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, they eat a lot of pork. They eat a lot of, like, obviously sushi and stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, like, you look around the world at people who live a long time, free of age-related chronic disease, disability, and there's immense dietary diversity. So there's no one size fits all diet. There's no one way to prevent chronic disease and to reach your optimal body composition, I think. And this is an area where I've evolved, and I think, like, I've softened my message, and I've embraced, I think, more nuance and a greater appreciation for the fact that humans are so adaptable. It really, I mean, dietary preference, I think, you know, as long as we acknowledge that today we tend to all have a preference for ultra-processed convenience foods because they're engineered to be hyper-palatable and super delicious. And, you know, people talk about intuitive eating. Well, you know, you put, like, you know, a large red velvet cake in front of me, like, my intuition wants me to eat that entire cake, you know? But save for that, I think personal preference reigns supreme, and you can kind of, like, you can calibrate your diet in accordance with your preferences and have that be a really healthful diet, provided you're minimizing your consumption of ultra-processed foods.
Were you in the fitness space or the health space when flexible dieting and if it fits your macros became super popular?
Not really, no. I mean,
it's like 2000.
I'm familiar.
11, 12.
Yeah. It always. I never abided by it, but it always struck me as, like, really silly that, you know, we can kind of, you know, like the Twinkie diet or whatever, like, insofar as we're hitting, like, a certain macro target, we can basically eat whatever the hell we want.
Right.
I mean, you can eat whatever the hell you want and lose weight. I'm not debating that. Calories, obviously, are the primary variable with regards to short-term weight loss, at least. But yeah, you also want to be healthy, like, while you're doing it, you know, and you want to set yourself up for success long-term as well. And I think if you're basing your diet around ultra-processed foods, even if you're hitting your macros, I mean, that, to me, that sounds like a recipe for hunger, given everything we know about how ultra-processed foods, the low satiety aspect of ultra-processed foods, and just how calorie dense they tend to be.
Yeah, when I got in the fitness space, started exploring it, it was college. And I decided I wanted to do my first bodybuilding show in college. So I was online searching YouTube fitness, how to lose weight, achieve a certain body composition. Didn't know anything about macros, really. And then I came across this surge of information that was so popular then of if it fits your macros, flexible dieting, tracking your macros in MyFitnessPal. It was really popular to try to fit Pop-Tarts into your diet then. And I kind of, you know, was attracted to this, and I saw people getting absolutely bone shredded on Pop-Tarts and cereal and all these things. And for a while, I adopted this lifestyle and this diet, and I just felt like crap because I was always hungry. I was obsessed over the macronutrient profile of foods. I was searching for the lowest calorie, highest volume food, which was typically artificial, ultra processed. There were all these companies launching products like Walden Farms that was like 0 calorie everything. Do you ever come across Walden Farms?
Yes, it's like they have syrups and dressings and
It's like these creamy ranch dressings with 0 calories. And I'm like, and peanut butter, 0 calories. And I just remember feeling like crap on this diet and this approach. And then over the years, I've been at this for a while now, really associating the quality of food and the nutrient profile with a feeling, being vibrant and energy and mental clarity, and not necessarily the quantity or the macronutrient profile or makeup of a food any longer, but the quality and the nutrients it provides me, and then the feeling associated with that quality. So for me, like, I don't even crave these ultra processed foods anymore because of the association of the feeling I get from these quality foods. As I was telling you, in the beginning of this episode or before we started recording, we recently started eating more sardines. And it could be placebo, it could be real, but I can feel this heightened sense of mental clarity from these sardines. Is it in my head? Maybe, but the placebo effect also works. And I know these sardines are loaded with great sources of omega-3 fatty acids and protein and quality sources of vitamins and minerals.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the if it fits your macros thing is funny. I do think like a flexible approach, and also like, you're a pro, like you're a bodybuilder, you have your situation like super dialed in. So I think like if you can fit in ultra processed foods as a part of the plan, and you're not allowing them to become the bulk of your diet as they are with so many people, then I think that's totally fine. Like I don't eat a perfect diet. I don't eat like 100% whole food diet. Like I certainly, will indulge now and then. And ultra processed foods, they're convenient, they're tasty, like they're safe, they're accessible. So I'm not, I think it's important to be a pragmatist, but yeah, I think most people are not as deliberate and discerning as you. It sounds like you're now able to be, or you were. Most people are consuming them, the bulks of their diet. There's actually a photo in my talks, sometimes my public, when I get like hired to go and give speeches, I show there's like anybody can Google this on Google Images. A photojournalist at one point did this project where he photographed families with their weekly grocery haul. And you can look at families in different countries and their weekly grocery haul. And it's like shocking the degree to which it's just like all ultra processed foods. And here in the US, about 60% of our calories are, from these like essentially like vending machine foods. Mm-hmm. That's what we're eating most of the time here in the United States, most of us. In the UK, it's a little bit better. It's about 50%. But even here in the United States, it's 60% on average. But if you look at different demographics, different, parts of the socioeconomic spectrum, it's even higher. Like children, it's 70% ultra processed foods on average. For unfortunately, Black Americans on average, 80% ultra processed foods. So it's like it's a systemic issue. I'm not saying that this is all choice, but yeah, it's like to have a little bit of ultra, that's a completely different situation, and I think it's totally fine.
You're right. Well, that's when I'm at the grocery store with my family and we're checking out, going through the line, and I'm an observant person, so I'll look at what other people are buying, and oftentimes you'll see everything they're putting onto that belt is ultra processed. And even like the fruit is like canned fruit, canned peaches in syrup, and
hefty dose of BPA in there probably as well.
Exactly. And I can't help but think, yes, it's a personal choice, but is it just lack of education and awareness and knowledge that they just don't know any better? It's really hard.
Yeah, I think education is a major part of it, and it's also there's collusion with the food industry that makes it really difficult for your average consumer. There was a Washington Post article that exposed the fact that a lot of these ultra-processed food companies, these multinational food companies, pay dietitians on social media to promote the idea that, all foods can fit, food is food, and that there are, basically like financially funding the notion that there are no such thing as good or bad foods. Now, you and I know that you can eat any food essentially here and there, and it's not going to have any impact on your health, right? Like there generally is no such thing as a good or bad food, but in the context of the standard American food environment and America as a whole, where we're all now pretty much, half of us are trending towards obesity, you might be able to make the case that a bad food is the food that causes you to overeat. The food that's like the most calorie dense food, the least satiating, the most difficult to moderate your consumption of. You might be able to paint it up, but the food industry is paying off dietitians to basically parrot this message over and over again.
That's scary.
It's scary, And so I think that creates echo chambers where people generally, who are well-intentioned, but we're all prone to confirmation bias. We all love to feel good about our decisions, right? End up on the pages of these various dietitians. And not all dietitians do this. There's some wonderful dietitians, not throwing shade at all the dietitians or the industry as a whole. But generally, like, they end up on these pages and it's like, oh, you mean processed foods are good? Like, there's nothing wrong with processed foods. I'm just going to keep doing what it is that I'm doing. And that the key to losing weight is just eating less and moving more. So I'm just going to try as hard as I can to eat less of, these foods that have driven my obesity to begin with. And I'm going to feel like a moral failure when that proves difficult. And it's just like this vicious cycle of like nobody really being honest about the food environment that we've inherited, we've inherited an obesogenic food environment.
It makes me think back to, we had these people over for dinner a few weeks ago, and one of the people that was over, I was making steaks, and they didn't want to eat the steak because they're trying to reduce their red meat consumption and the amount of fat in their diet. But then as soon as dinner was over, they're snacking on like cookies and chips and all these things. Well, like, it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
Nice try. So you mentioned grass-fed, finished red meat, eggs, green leafy vegetables. I know you've talked about like olive oil, wild caught fish, dark chocolate, for example. Yeah. Anything else outside of those, or those key players?
Yeah, like dark chocolate is great. Extra virgin olive oil. That's a big one. I'm not a big fan. Well, I've evolved my view on this, I think, as well. I don't think, adding a lot of fat to your food makes a lot of sense generally, but if you are, there's really good, there are really good reasons to make that fat that you're adding to your food extra virgin olive oil because of the fatty acid profile. It's rich in monounsaturated fat, which we know is, it's an unsaturated fat, but it is also chemically stable. So it's not prone to oxidation. It's also a rich source of phytochemicals, various phytochemicals that have been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect. And we now have meta-analyses that show us that extra virgin olive oil can lead to a reduction in certain inflammatory biomarkers. And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of extra virgin olive oil. I think it should be the primary oil in one's kitchen. It's a myth that you can't cook with it. You can totally cook with it. It's great as a finishing sauce, essentially. And extra virgin olive oil is great.
We use it to cook pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Extra virgin olive oil.
I don't know why there's this like pervasive myth that you can't cook with it. In the Mediterranean region of the world, I mean, that population pretty much invented extra virgin olive oil, and they use it to cook with religiously. Like you won't find canola oil, soybean oil. You won't find any of those highly marketed novel oils in a truly Mediterranean kitchen. It's primarily extra virgin olive oil, and the fact that it's composed of these chemically stable fatty acids, but then you have the addition of these really powerful antioxidants protect the oil through the heating process. It doesn't have the highest smoke point, so if you want an oil with a very high smoke point, you might want to use instead avocado oil, macadamia nut oil, or even a more saturated fat like tallow or ghee or something. But extra virgin olive oil it's a fantastic oil to cook with.
You mentioned this earlier, that when your mom was sick, you were using the sauna a lot. I'm assuming that's just for maybe some meditative time and just like de-stressing. And like for me, sweating sometimes just feels really good. And like I'm in the sauna, uncomfortable, just need that like time by myself. But there's also a lot of research behind sauna usage and prevention of dementia, correct?
Yeah.
Are you a firm believer in that?
I am, yeah. Well, the research is sparse, but I think it is supportive of a preventative role for saunas. A lot of it comes from Finland, which is the sauna capital of the world. There's one sauna on average per household in Finland. And so taking a sauna in Finland is akin to taking a shower here in the US. It's very much a part of the self-care routine. It's not like like here in the United States, sauna use might be a privilege afforded to people who can afford to have a sauna in their homes. It might be something that people that can afford a fancy gym membership or routine, spa visits might access. But in Finland, it's much more commonplace. And so a lot of the observational research on sauna use comes from Finland, which I think is really good because that eliminates some of that healthy user bias. Mm-hmm. And what they've shown in Finland is that routine sauna use is associated with reduced risk for hypertension, stroke, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease. And I think that that's probably, I would bet money that there's an actual effect happening there. It's not just correlation. I think that there is probably causation there. When you see that sauna use, it increases your heart rate, so you're kind of getting like a mild workout, like an aerobic workout when you're sitting in it. It's a hormetic stressor, so it increases the production of all these like detoxification compounds. There's some evidence that it might boost BDNF in the brain, which is like a Miracle-Gro protein that we know is diminished in Alzheimer's disease and even depression. It boosts nitric oxide. There's all these, I think, mechanisms that support that observation. And so, yeah, I think the data suggests, if I recall correctly, 2 to 3 times a week, there's about a 20% reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. It might be higher, actually, and 4 to 7 times a week, between 35 and 50% reduced risk.
Wow.
Yeah, I might be skewing those numbers. It's been a minute since I've looked at that research, but yeah, it's fairly easy to find, and yeah, I'm a believer. It's also a route of detoxification, which is, I think, an unsung hero of sauna use, is that you're actually excreting, a lot of these like environmental toxicants out, through your sweat glands that you wouldn't otherwise excrete, like compounds that are not as easily released by the liver into the gut or peed out, for example. You sweat out some of these compounds as well.
There's a lot of people really preaching the benefits of sauna usage for the prevention of dementia. It doesn't sound like you're completely sold on it. Is it like in a list of priorities, is it lower on your list of things to do to prevent?
That's a great question, because I've always thought of myself as being really gung-ho about sauna. But yeah, I think if you're sitting in the sauna regularly, but you're 30 pounds overweight and you've got hypertension, or although saunas can be used to reduce, I think hypertension, but you want to be careful if you have hypertension. There's a risk there. But yeah, I think like if you don't have access to a sauna, there's still a lot you can do to reduce your risk. So I'm a huge fan of sauna, don't get me wrong, but I think if you're 30 pounds overweight or more, I think you're like focus on that, and reducing your exposure to air pollution and the like. I would give those higher priority.
I guess sauna is, like you said, kind of in the US, more of a luxury. I mean, most people don't have $5,000 to $10,000 just to spend on a sauna to add to their house.
Oh yeah. I mean, I bought myself a sauna like 4 years ago, and I thought I was like the most privileged person on the planet to have my own sauna. It's just so rare.
I do love having a sauna, though.
Yeah, it's great.
I love it.
No, I'm a huge fan. I am a huge fan. I don't want to underplay how valuable saunas are. I think because I do think they play a protective role. But for people that don't have it, I don't think, there are other levers. I think other levers with more evidence, to kind of lean on.
So with Little Empty Boxes, launching here in the next couple of days, a project you've been working on for 10 years now, what is a goal with it? Like, what is your hope that it achieves in the next 12 plus months?
Man, I just hope that I want people to watch it. I want people to experience it. I want people to share it and share it among loved ones and within their communities, and to watch the film with family. It's a really powerful experience because it is also about family. And it's a really moving piece. It's not one of these documentaries that's like pushing a nutrition agenda, even though I love to talk about nutrition. It really is a film that I think focuses on that which matters most in life, and that is family, love, supporting loved ones in times of need. And so I hope it resonates with people for those reasons, first and foremost. And then ultimately, because it does paint with broad strokes a roadmap in terms of how one might live to reduce their risk for these kinds of conditions, I hope that it inspires people to take action, so that what it was that my mom and I experienced wasn't in vain. I'll never get to have my mom back, but if what she went through and what we went through as a family can inspire others to, make positive change in their lifestyles, then I think in a way it wasn't in vain. And we all go, I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anybody does. There's this Ram Dass quote that I love. At the end of the day, we're all just walking each other home. So insofar as it provides some degree of illumination or even solace for somebody who has already lost somebody due to dementia, then I think that would be a positive effect of the film.
I mean, it was very well done from a storytelling perspective, cinematic perspective, and then like a really good message and narrative. It had me engaged the whole time. And me and my wife were watching it, and we have a 2-year-old daughter, then we have a baby on the way. My wife's due in 2 months with our second, our boy. So we're, thinking ahead of when we're older and our kids are taking care of us, what can we do now to really set us up for health success in the future? And as I'm starting to get a little bit older, I'm just looking at life so much differently than I was 5-10 years ago, where around food choices, the foods that I was consuming, like I was telling you earlier, were primarily focused around performance and aesthetics. And they are still to an extent, but now I'm thinking, well, how are my food choices, which doesn't change them much, but just being more conscious and having more conversations with people. How do these food choices not only affect us, but our family and the people in our lives and our friends and where we take our lives and where we end up, because the choices we're making today are going to dictate where we're at in decades ahead. And it's all, I don't want to say all preventative, but prevention is the name of the game. And it's the one thing that we can manipulate and control and own to set us up for the future.
Yeah, and you can do both. Like, that's another misconception that, you either have to pick looking phenomenal and being super fit or keep your eye on the long-term game. Like, the diets are the same.
Completely.
They're the same.
Yeah, I definitely don't think they're different diets. I think the way I'm positioning that is it's just some small intentional decisions and choices of different sources and quality and variation of options, including into our diet, but then also sharing with my kids and my family and teaching them what a healthy plate looks like and shopping the perimeter of a grocery store as opposed to the aisles and going to the farmer's market and loading up on all these fruits and veggies and trying to consume them within 7 days and turning it into this game and all of these things, not just because, hey, if you don't eat this, you won't get fat. But no, if you don't eat this and you eat this, you're going to feel really good when you're older. And that might not mean something to you right now, and it probably doesn't, but someday it will.
Yeah, I love that, man. That is the name of the game.
Yeah. Well, Max, I appreciate you, man. By the time this episode's out, your film will be released into the world. Long time coming, I know, and lots of work went into it. So congratulations, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Nick. It means a lot to have gotten to come and hang with you. And yeah, I love your work, and I've consumed a lot of your content. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, brother. And littleemptyboxes.com is where people can get the film.
Beautiful.